3:28 a.m. Rzeszów Airport, southeastern Poland. 50 degrees north latitude, 22 degrees east longitude. The airport had been a regional commercial facility until February 2022. In the months that followed, its function changed. The cargo terminals were expanded. The apron areas were reinforced for heavier aircraft. The fuel storage capacity was quadrupled. A new access road was constructed on the western perimeter that connected directly to the military compound adjacent to the civilian terminal. By the end of that year, Rzeszów had become the primary logistics transit hub for materiel moving from NATO stockpiles and Allied defense industries eastward, the physical point through which the majority of military equipment, ammunition, and supplies passed before crossing the Ukrainian border. By the time of the current engagement, the facility had processed an estimated $47 billion in military assistance over 31 months. It had been the subject of Russian diplomatic protests, public statements from Russian officials who had named it explicitly as a legitimate military target, and at least 3 previous periods of elevated alert following intelligence assessments that assessed a Russian strike as possible. None of those assessments had resulted in the deployment of a full defensive architecture commensurate with the facility's operational significance. The political constraints on positioning large U.S. military assets in close proximity to the Ukrainian border had shaped every deployment decision. The Patriot PAC-3 battery at Rzeszów was a single-fire unit. The F-35A detachment at the base was 4 aircraft on rotational alert. The Aegis-capable surface-to-space was a discussion that had not been completed. The assessment of the facility as a likely target had been accurate for 31 months. The consequence of that accuracy had not yet materialized, which had shaped the political risk calculation in a direction that reduced rather than increased the defensive investment. At 3:28 a.m., the consequence materialized. From 11 TEL positions in the Kaliningrad Oblast, Grodno, and Smolensk regions, positions that had been selected to maximize approach geometry coverage of the southeastern Poland target zone, the Iskander-M launch sequence activated. Simultaneously, from Rzeszów Air Base in the Kaluga region, 2 MiG-31K aircraft that had been on ground alert since 2:11 a.m. began their takeoff roll. The combined package, 27 Iskander-M ballistic missiles from 3 geographic origins, and 2 Kh-47M2 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles from the MiG-31K aircraft, timed to arrive in a sequenced window designed to exhaust the Patriot battery's intercept capacity with the Iskander package before the Kinzhals arrived. The sequencing was precise. Iskander-M from the Kaliningrad positions had a flight time of approximately 11 minutes to Rzeszów. Iskander-M from the Smolensk region had a flight time of approximately 9 minutes. Iskander-M from the Grodno positions in Belarus had a flight time of approximately 7 minutes. By launching the farthest first and the closest last, the Russian operational planners had arranged the inbound tracks to arrive in near-simultaneous convergence despite the different range bands. The Kinzhal's release point, approximately 850 kilometers northeast of Rzeszów, reachable by the MiG-31K from Rzeszów in approximately 48 minutes at maximum speed, placed the weapons release at 3:16 a.m. if the aircraft achieved their scheduled release window. The Kinzhal's terminal phase would arrive over Rzeszów approximately 5 minutes after the last Iskander impact. A Patriot battery that had just expended most of its ready load against 27 Iskander-M would face 2 Kinzhal hypersonic weapons with whatever interceptors remained. The engagement had been designed as a sequence, not a salvo. 3:16 a.m. Rzeszów Air Base, Kaluga region, Russia. The 2 MiG-31K aircraft had been loaded with Kh-47M2 Kinzhal weapons 12 hours earlier during a maintenance window that was not distinguishable from routine store loading activities visible from commercial satellite coverage. The Kinzhal's loading on the MiG-31K took place in a covered shelter. The aircraft's departure, at maximum speed on a southwest heading, had been tracked from the moment of brake release by the U.S. European Command's Signals Intelligence Architecture. The tracking had generated an alert at 3:17 a.m., 1 minute after the aircraft became airborne. The intelligence assessment of the Kinzhal alert and the simultaneous launch signature from the Iskander-TL positions had reached Ramstein at 3:18 a.m. The two events had been correlated within 40 seconds. The combined alert, Iskander-M launch and MiG-31K with Kinzhal payload inbound, had been transmitted to Rzeszow at 3:19 a.m., 3 minutes before the first Iskander arrived. The base commander at Rzeszow had been awake since 2:47 a.m., when the elevated intelligence assessment had reached the 4th U.S. Army Corps headquarters that had responsibility for the facility's force protection. He had been managing the evacuation of personnel to hardened shelter positions since 3:02 a.m., when the alert posture had been elevated, following the MiG-31K's departure detection from Rzeszów. He had the non-essential personnel movements completed and the logistics documentation secured in hardened storage by 3:14 a.m. When the mass attack alert arrived at 3:19 a.m., he had 14 minutes of preparation in place. 14 minutes had moved the people. It had not moved the cargo. The cargo, 340 containers of mixed military materiel staged on the eastern apron awaiting transport, remained on the apron. The fuel farm's primary storage tanks remained in place. The communications relay infrastructure that connected the facility's operations center to the NATO Logistics Command remained in its building. The runway itself remained where it had always been. 14 minutes of warning had saved the people. It had not saved the infrastructure. 3:22 a.m. Rzeszów. Patriot Battery Fire Control Center. The battery commander had been in her fire control center since 3:06 a.m. Her single fire unit had 48 PAC-3 MSE interceptors across 2 launcher groups. The approaching track count was 27 Iskander-M and 2 Kinzhal. Against 27 Iskander-M tracks, 48 interceptors provided a 1.78 interceptors per track average. The standard triage protocol allocated 3 interceptors per track to priority aim points and 2 to lower priority zones. A protocol that her battery's ready load could not sustain at that ratio across 27 tracks. She made the allocation manually, not the algorithm. She assigned 3 interceptors each to the 8 Iskander tracks, whose projected impact points fell within the critical infrastructure zone. The fuel farm, the communications relay, the primary cargo staging area, and the runway complex. She assigned 2 interceptors each to the remaining 19 tracks. Total allocated, 24 plus 38 equals 62 interceptors. She had 48. She reallocated. Reduced the non-critical zone allocation to 1 interceptor per track for 12 of the 19 lower priority targets. Reserved 14 interceptors for the Kinzhal engagement that was coming after. Accepted that 7 of the non-critical zone tracks would have no assigned interceptor. It was not a good allocation. There was no good allocation for 27 missiles and 48 interceptors when the engagement sequencing had been specifically designed to exhaust her before the harder problem arrived. She transmitted her allocation and the engagement request to the AAMDC coordination cell at 3:22 a.m., simultaneously asking whether any additional intercept assets could be directed to Rzeszow's coverage zone before the Kinzhal arrival. The AAMDC's response, the nearest additional Patriot fire unit, was 180 kilometers northwest at Lublin. Its engagement geometry for inbound tracks from the northeast required a lateral intercept solution that degraded probability. It was allocated to attempt coverage of Rzeszow's highest priority targets from its current position. The Lublin battery added 12 SM-3 equivalent PAC 3 engagements against the Iskander tracks, whose approach geometry it could manage from its position. Combined engagement assets, 1 Rzeszów battery, 1 Lublin battery, plus a single-ship Aegis BMD platform, USS Bulkeley, operating in the Baltic Sea at maximum intercept range geometry, 340 kilometers from Rzeszów, providing SM-3 Block 2A coverage of the mid-course phase against the Kaliningrad and Smolensk origin Iskander packages. USS Bulkeley had been positioned in the Baltic since the elevated alert had been issued 6 days earlier. Its SM-3 engagement geometry from its current position was not optimal against targets whose terminal phase occurred over southeastern Poland. The angular geometry placed the engagement at the edge of the SM-3's effective envelope with a modeled per-shot probability of 58% compared to the 72% optimal figure. It was the best available geometry from a single Baltic deployed ship. Between 3:22 a.m. and 3:27 a.m., the combined intercept network engaged the 27 Iskander-M package. USS Bulkeley fired 14 SM-3 against the mid-course phase of the Kaliningrad and Smolensk origin missiles. 7 intercepts achieved. 7 continued to terminal phase. The Rzeszov and Lublin Patriot batteries engaged the terminal phase survivors and the Belarus origin package, which had been too close and low trajectory for SM-3 mid-course engagement. Combined PAC-3 engagements. 31 interceptors expended. 17 intercepts achieved across both batteries. Of 27 Iskander-M, 24 intercepted. 3 impacted. The 3 survivors were from the Belarus origin group that had been at the lowest approach angle and shortest flight time, providing the least engagement window across all 3 layers. 2 impacted in the cargo staging area. 1 impacted the runway threshold at the runway's eastern end. The cargo staging area impacts detonated 2 containers of artillery propellant charges staged in the eastern apron zone. The secondary detonations from the propellant containers created a fire that the base's fire suppression teams were managing at 3:28 a.m. when the Kinzhal arrived. The Rzeszov Patriot battery had 14 interceptors remaining. The Kinzhal release had occurred at 3:16 a.m., 850 kilometers northeast of Rzeszov, at an altitude of 21,000 meters. The Kh-47M2's initial boost phase took it above 50,000 meters before its glide descent toward the target. Its terminal approach speed, Mach 10. Its terminal maneuvering capability, up to 40 degrees lateral deviation in the final 60 seconds of flight. First radar acquisition by the Rzeszov Patriot batteries AN/MPQ 65 fire control radar, 3:28 a.m. Time to impact from acquisition, 58 seconds. 58 seconds. 14 interceptors. 2 weapons. The battery commander assigned 7 PAS-3 MSE interceptors to each Kinzhal track. A 3+3 allocation with 1 reserve per track for a re-engagement attempt if the first intercept missed. Against a Mach 10 maneuvering weapon with a 58-second terminal window, the PAC-3 MSE's per-shot engagement probability was modeled at 41% to 57%, depending on the lateral maneuver rate observed at time of intercept. 7 interceptors at 50% mean probability produced a combined engagement probability of approximately 99.2%. The mathematics of independent probability cascades. The mathematics did not account for a sensor problem that materialized at 3:28 a.m. The Kh-47M2 electronic warfare system that had been activated from a position in the Grodno region at 3:22 a.m., simultaneous with the Iskander terminal phase, had been jamming the Patriot's frequency bands throughout the Iskander engagement. The frequency hopping protocol had reduced the jamming penalty to approximately 9 seconds per engagement cycle. Against the Iskander's 2 to 3 minute terminal phase, 9 seconds per cycle was manageable. Against the Kinzhal's 58-second terminal phase, a 9-second jamming penalty on each engagement cycle meant that the first firing solution required the full jamming mitigation cycle before the intercept could be committed. The first PAC-3 launch against Kinzhal Track Alpha 1 was delayed by 9 seconds from acquisition, reducing the effective intercept window from 58 seconds to 49 seconds, and the intercept range from 47 kilometers to 39 kilometers. At 39 kilometers range and Mach 10 approach speed, the Kinzhal's first lateral maneuver was executed 6 seconds before the first PAC-3 intercept reached its guidance solution. The maneuver shifted the track 18 degrees. The first PAC-3 missed by 31 meters. Second PAC-3 from the first battery, already in flight, had been built on the pre-maneuver track prediction. It missed by 44 meters. The third PAC-3 incorporated the post-maneuver track. Intercept at 29 kilometers range. Direct hit. Track Alpha 1 was neutralized. Track Alpha 2 had been running its own maneuver sequence while the first engagement was processing. The 9-second jamming delay had accumulated into a cumulative 17-second deficit in the Alpha 2 engagement timeline. The first intercept against Alpha 2 launched at 41 seconds remaining, rather than the 58-second window the protocol required. The PAC-3 engaged at 26 kilometers range. The Kinzhal's second lateral maneuver occurred 4 seconds before intercept. The first PAC-3 missed. The second PAC-3 against Alpha 2 achieved direct hit at 3:29 a.m., 19 seconds before projected impact. Both Kinzhals were neutralized. The Patriot battery had 0 interceptors remaining. The fire at the cargo staging area was being contained by the base fire suppression teams. The runway eastern threshold was non-operational from the Iskander impact, but the western 2,100 meters of the primary runway was assessed as intact and potentially usable for cargo operations. The communications relay was intact. None of the Iskander impacts had struck within 200 meters of the relay building. The fuel farm was intact. The base was damaged. It was not eliminated. At 3:44 a.m., 16 minutes after the last Kinzhal impact, the first C-17 from Ramstein Air Base landed on the Rzeszow runway's western section, with a payload that included 2 Patriot PAC, 3 MSE reload containers, and the crew to operate them. A second C-17 carrying a second fire unit was airborne from Ramstein simultaneously, landing at 4:11 a.m. The reload operation was complete at 4:37 a.m. The Rzeszov Patriot defense had been non-operational for 68 minutes between the battery commander's last interceptor launch and the completion of the first reload. 68 minutes without interceptor coverage of the NATO logistics hub, through which $47 billion in military assistance had transited. No second Russian salvo had arrived in those 68 minutes. The intelligence picture through the 68-minute window showed no preparation activity at the Iskander-Tel positions. The batteries that had fired had dispersed to reload and repositioning positions following the launch, a standard survival tactic that removed them from their launch positions before any NATO counterstrike could reach those positions. The MiG-31K aircraft had landed at an alternate airfield rather than returning to Rzeszów, recognizing that the NATO targeting cycle would prioritize Rzeszów after the Kinzhal employment. The counterstrike under Operation DNIEPER LINE had been authorized at 3:41 a.m., 13 minutes after the last Kinzhal impact. The authorization covered the 3 groups of Iskander-TEL positions from which the launch signatures had been confirmed. It did not cover the Rzeszów Air Base or the Grodno electronic warfare position. Both of those targets required additional authorization tier review that the NSC watch team was processing. HIMARS batteries from the 41st Field Artillery Brigade, positioned in eastern Poland under the enhanced forward presence rotation, fired their first M31 unitary rocket salvos at the Kaliningrad adjacent TL, last known positions at 3:44 a.m. 4 confirmed TEL position strikes in the first 12 minutes. 4 TEL positions had been vacated before the HIMARS rounds arrived. B-1B Lancers from Dyess Air Force Base, already airborne on extended patrol, received their JAS-SMER strike packages for the Smolensk region TEL infrastructure at 3:51 a.m. The weapons would reach the target area at 4:47 a.m. The Grodno electronic warfare position authorization was received at 4:02 a.m. An AARGM-ER from a Polish F-16 CJ aircraft that had been in holding orbit over eastern Poland since 3:31 a.m. reached the Krasuka 4 position at 4:09 a.m. The Krasuka 4 had been active for 47 minutes. It had produced a 9-second per cycle jamming penalty that had reduced the PAC-3 engagement window against the Kinzhal by 17 cumulative seconds. Those 17 seconds had cost 4 PAC-3 interceptors, 2 misses against each Kinzhal, rather than the first-shot intercepts that the uncontested engagement model projected. Against the same weapon count, but without the 17-second deficit, the battery would have had 7 PAC-3 rounds remaining, rather than 0. The margin between 7 remaining interceptors and 0 remaining interceptors was the margin between a battery that could defend against a follow-on attack and one that could not. The 68-minute reload window had been purchased by 17 cumulative seconds of electronic warfare effect, 47 minutes of jamming, 4 extra interceptors expended, 68 minutes of coverage gap. The exchange rate of an electronic warfare system against a missile defense battery was not measured in warheads. It was measured in interceptor magazines. The Kh-47M2 had cost approximately $3.8 million to produce and operate for this engagement. The 4 additional PAC-3 MSE interceptors it had caused to be expended had a replacement cost of approximately $16 million. The 68-minute gap had no cost assigned in any procurement document. It was the gap between the system working as designed and the adversary exploiting the moment when it stopped working because the magazine ran out. 4:37 AM. Rzeszów. Patriot battery reload completion. The battery commander transmitted the operational readiness report at 4:37 AM. 48 interceptors across 2 fire units. The first reload load, which was the maximum the airlift had been able to bring in the available window. Full standard load. Her fire control radar was tracking. Her engagement systems were active. She had been without interceptors for 68 minutes. During those 68 minutes, she had sat in her fire control center with an active radar and no weapons, watching the threat picture that her radar was presenting and knowing that if anything had appeared on that screen, she had nothing to commit against it. Nothing had appeared. She logged the operational readiness restoration at 4:37 AM. She did not note the 68 minutes in any way the log format did not already capture. The log showed 3:29 AM as last intercept and 4:37 AM as operational readiness restored. The gap was implicit in those 2 numbers. She began her next watch cycle. Time from first Iskander launch detection to last Kinzhal impact, 13 minutes. Time from last Kinzhal impact to first reload, complete, 68 minutes. Time from first Iskander to DNIEPER line counterstrike authorization, 13 minutes. Time from authorization to first HIMARS impact, 3 minutes. Russian weapons employed. 27 Iskander-M ballistic missiles from 3 geographic origins. 2 Kh-47M, 2 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles from MiG, 31K air launch platform. Iskander-M results. 14 intercepted by SM-3 from USS Bulkeley. 17 intercepted by PAC, 3 MSE from Rzeszów and Lublin batteries. 3 impacted. Intercept rate, 88.9%. Kinzhal results, 2 of 2 neutralized by PAC, 3 MSE, each requiring 3 interceptors, due to Kh-47M2, 4 jamming-induced delay. 0 impacted. Intercept rate, 100%. Physical effects, Rzeszów cargo staging area. 2 Iskander impacts. Secondary detonation of propellant containers, fire suppressed. Runway eastern threshold, 1 Iskander impact. Western 2,100 meters intact and operational. Fuel farm, intact. Communications relay, intact. US and NATO personnel. 4 service members injured from blast effects during the cargo staging area secondary detonation. 0 killed. Shelter protocols effective. Counter-operation DNIEPER line. HIMARS against Kaliningrad adjacent tel positions. 4 strikes confirmed. 4 positions vacated before impact. B-1BJ AS-SMER against Smolensk region TEL infrastructure. Impacts at 4:47 AM. Polish F-16 CJAAR GMER against Grodno Kh-47M2 4 position, impact at 4:09 a.m. Tchaikovka Air Base, authorization, pending second-tier review. Battery interceptor magazine post-engagement, 0. First reload complete at 4:37 a.m. Total engagement cost including all interceptors and counterstrike, $940 million. The engagement had protected the NATO logistics hub. The runway was partially operational. The fuel farm was intact. The communications relay was intact. The cargo staging area had been damaged but not eliminated. The facility would process its next logistics convoy. The engagement had also demonstrated the specific vulnerability of a single battery point defense against a sequenced engagement designed to exhaust it before the harder weapon arrived. And the 68-minute exposure window that resulted when it did. A second battery, permanently deployed, would have eliminated the 68-minute gap. The cost of a permanent second battery deployment was approximately $140 million annually. The political cost of its presence in southeastern Poland, given the facility's proximity to the Ukrainian border, had been assessed as too high to recommend in 3 consecutive force structure reviews. The third consecutive review had been completed 4 months ago. Its recommendation had been the same as the previous 2. The fourth would be scheduled for Monday.